Is it finally time for Donovan Mitchell to ask out of Utah? For some time now, Donovan was seen as a next potential disgruntled star that would ask for a trade, and with the whole drama with him and Rudy Gobert going down recently, combined with the fact that the Utah Jazz once again disappointed in the playoffs, a lot of people are starting to think that it's finally time for Donovan to ask out of Utah. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy Sports, I make opinionated NBA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. I also want to quickly mention I recently started up an MMA channel, and if you guys are interested in that, the link will be in the description. But anyways, let's get into it. Donovan Mitchell has been one of the better players in the NBA for some time now. The amount of skill that he has offensively, combined with the willingness to work hard in order to improve his game, the leadership that he shows, basically Donovan has every trait that you would want for your franchise guy. And he's been the franchise guy for the Utah Jazz for some time now. And overall, I would say that Donovan fits in pretty nicely with this Jazz team. And over the past few seasons, the Jazz have certainly had a ton of success during the regular season, but one of the bigger issues with the Jazz, and one of the potential reasons for why Donovan may want out, is once they make it to the playoffs, they don't necessarily make it past the first or maybe second round if they could make it that far. And this is a similar situation that a bunch of different teams face. One of the better examples of this is the Portland Trailblazers with Damian Lillard, where they're always pretty good during the regular season, but once it comes down to the playoffs, they can't really make it all that far, maybe the first or second round. And at a certain point, their star player, which would be Dame in that situation, or Donovan Mitchell in this situation, would eventually get upset and either A, request a trade or demand something to change. And obviously at this point, Donovan has not formally requested a trade out of Utah, but at the same time, it seems like he's relatively close to doing so. If either something that he doesn't like happens, or maybe as time progresses, he just will eventually request a trade out of Utah. Because after last season's playoff failure, he was certainly very upset about the situation, and a lot of people were speculating after last year that he may request a trade out of Utah, but of course that did not happen. But after the same thing happened once again this year, as they did fail in the playoffs, Donovan once again looked just as frustrated as he did last year, maybe even more frustrated, and people once again are speculating on whether Donovan would request a trade out of Utah eventually. But the added wrinkle into this whole Donovan Mitchell situation is not only is he upset with the playoff failure from the Utah Jazz, but he's also reportedly upset about his teammate in Rudy Gobert. Apparently these guys don't get along all that well, and also according to reports, both of these guys don't necessarily want to play together all that much longer. Now, one thing that I will say is similar reports have come out in the past that two players don't necessarily like each other, or they don't want to play together that much longer, and it has come out in the past that some of those reports weren't necessarily true, and the two players that they said didn't like each other actually did, and that was just never true. It was something made up by the media. A great example of that is Kyrie Irving and LeBron James. It was made out after Kyrie left Cleveland that Kyrie and LeBron didn't necessarily like each other, but recently Kyrie came out and said all that was false, and him and LeBron didn't necessarily have any issues with each other. So basically what I'm trying to say is not all these reports that you see are all that accurate all the time, but the reason why I think this report about Donovan and Rudy has a little more validity to it is due to the amount of reports that have been coming out about these guys, and also due to the fact that neither one of these guys have really came out to the media and adamantly denied these rumors. So whether or not these reports are actually true, I guess we'll never know until one of these guys actually say it flat out, but I think in my opinion these rumors have a lot more validity to some of the other reports that came out in the past about different players. But one thing that I will say, if Donovan did go to the Utah Jazz and said either you have to trade me or you have to trade Rudy Gobert, obviously the Jazz are going to pick Donovan and trade away Rudy. But at the same time, if Donovan didn't want to be in Utah anyway, this could just be another reason on his list for why he wanted to leave. But now, what's my opinion on this? Do I think Donovan is actually going to leave Utah, or do I think he's going to stay with the Jazz for the rest of his career? Well, in my opinion, I certainly think it's up in the air at this point. There's certainly a bunch of factors that would lead you to believe that Donovan will request a trade relatively soon. The main factor being the lack of success in the playoffs, and maybe some could point to Donovan as the reason for why the Jazz haven't been all that great once it comes down to the playoffs, because you always blame the star player for failure, especially when it comes down to the playoffs. I personally don't think Donovan is the reason why the Jazz haven't been all that successful in the playoffs, but maybe some NBA fans could point to that. But if Donovan can find another situation where maybe he could be the best player on the team, or maybe the second best player in the team, but that team would have a much better chance of winning an NBA a championship, at least in his opinion, maybe he would see that situation as a lot more attractive and he could potentially request a trade out of Utah. And it wouldn't really matter whether people were blaming Donovan for the playoff failure or not in Utah. But at the same time, the fact that Donovan has not requested a trade out of Utah at this point, after he was obviously very frustrated after the failure last year and also very frustrated after the failure this season, is certainly a positive for the Utah Jazz and their fans, and maybe he does want to stay with the Jazz for the rest of his career. And maybe all these reports are just reports and they're not actually true. At this point, I think there's certainly arguments to be made both ways, but if I had to personally guess at this point, I would say it's probably 40 to 45% likely that Donovan would request a trade out of Utah, at least during this offseason. But at the same time, I think that percentage would go way up if the Jazz don't really do all that much during this offseason, and after next season is over, the Jazz once again have a pretty good regular season, but fail once it comes down to the playoffs, and maybe lose in the first or second round. If that were to happen, I would probably say the likelihood of Donovan requesting a trade would then go up to around 65 to 70%. But if Donovan does stay with the Jazz, at least after this offseason, and the Jazz do make a bunch of moves, and they do get a lot better, and going into next season, maybe they do make it decently far in the playoffs, or maybe potentially win the whole thing, at that point, I would say it's probably very likely that Donovan would stay with Utah for the rest of his career, or at least for a pretty long time. But if Donovan were to ask for a trade, the Jazz would probably get around 3 first-round picks and 2 pretty nice young players in return. It seems like at this point, that's kind of the going rate for these star players, and maybe at that point, the Jazz could use those draft picks they got and the nice young players they got in return to start a rebuild, and maybe they could also trade away Rudy Gobert in order to get more assets in return and just completely blow everything up and just rebuild. Now, I'm sure the Utah Jazz don't want to do that. They much rather keep Donovan and build around him for the long-term future, but that's probably what they would get in return if they did end up going in the direction of trading him away. Now, teams that could potentially be interested are, of course, the New York Knicks, as they are interested in basically every star player that becomes disgruntled, and they also would have enough assets to trade for Donovan, and there's also been some reports saying that Donovan would want to go to the Knicks if he were to get traded. Once again, we don't know how true those reports are because we don't even know if Donovan wants to get traded from the Jazz, but of course that's a possibility. The Miami Heat have also been floated around there, but if Donovan were to officially request a trade out of Utah, basically every single team in the NBA would submit their offers, because it's pretty clear at this point that Donovan is an absolute superstar, and that's pretty clear based upon the numbers he's been able to put up basically ever since he got drafted into the NBA. But even besides the numbers, whenever you watch Donovan out there, it's obvious to everybody watching that this guy's just amazing. What he's able to do from that 3-point range, from that mid-range, driving all the way to the basket, his passing and playmaking ability is pretty good, his defense is pretty good. He's just a very, very skillful player at this point that basically could do everything out there on the offensive side of the court. But this is certainly a very interesting situation, and we'll see what happens as time progresses. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think Donovan Mitchell will request a trade from the Utah Jazz, or do you think he's going to stay there for the rest of his career? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these 2 videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out, guys.